Hey everyone, Brian Beeler here with our latest podcast, and you can tell if you get the visual of this and not just the audio that we're on location out in Anaheim, California in the offices of DataON, and we've arranged to have a really great guest today. Well, it remains to be seen, but I suspect he'll be a great guest today. The guy behind Azure Stack HCI at Microsoft. Let's bring in none other than Cosmos Darwin. Cosmos, thanks for joining today.
Brian, thanks for having me. I'm coming to you live on location from my house.
Yeah, well, you know, that is the modern version, right, of these things. So just because I happen to be sitting in DataON's conference room with their new Intel systems and Optane and QLC, don't let that distract you. I mean, we're here mostly to talk about Azure Stack HCI.
I am happy to talk about Azure Stack HCI or the latest in storage innovation or whatever it is that you want to talk about.
All of it's good. Let's start at a high level. So we've worked on a number of these systems from DataON, from Dell also with the AX nodes. Really great platform that not enough people know about, especially the performance profile. I know how excited you got at your conference. Gosh, it's probably been 3 years ago now about your giant IOPS numbers. But what's the latest?
Yeah, it's a great question. We spend a lot of time having fun with pushing the performance of our software-defined infrastructure stack with Azure Stack HCI. I think what you're seeing actually, especially in the last maybe 2 to 3 years, is that our message from the Azure team is changing significantly. So if you had gone to, let's say, one of the most recent in-person occurrences of the Microsoft Ignite conference, what you would have seen is Microsoft executives coming out saying, hey, you should migrate to the public cloud, right? It was just sort of a very like one bullet point message. And actually the strategy from Azure has changed significantly in the last couple of years. And I mean, if you go to azure.com, like right now today, one of the biggest words on the screen right at the top is on-premises, right? And that's part of our new mission with Azure and Azure Arc to sort of build tools and build services that help customers to innovate wherever they are. And Azure Stack HCI is a super central part of that strategy. And so more than ever, I mean, our teams are having a ton of fun building out new capabilities and tools and services around, especially, the high performance storage that is so popular with HCI, to really help customers take advantage of Azure if they're not moving to a public cloud. And I think that's a super important distinction, and it's a big push for us at Microsoft.
Well, I mean, you weren't alone at Microsoft to be cloud, maybe cloud first or cloud only, depending on how far you went with that messaging in the early days, because there was legit excitement about the cloud, right? Organizations wanted to take advantage of the immediacy of the cloud, of the OpEx versus CapEx, like all of these things. And so it was real and understandable why you would jump there. But now it seems like we've really sort of transitioned or fallen back to this hybrid cloud model where you'd have something like Azure Stack HCI on-prem and then take advantage of cloud services in addition to. Is that kind of how it's feeling?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, hybrid really is the key word. What I think has become clear in the last couple of years is that the crushing majority of customers are going to take advantage of the cloud in some capacity. But they're not going to be able to move 100% of what they do, of their IT estate, into a public cloud. It's just not going to make business sense or practical or technical sense for every single thing that they do. And so, I mean, if you look at Azure, it's certainly not like people aren't using Azure, right? 95% of the Fortune 500 actively uses Microsoft Azure every day. But they also have workloads that have legitimate reasons that they need to remain outside of a cloud, right? Whether that's latency or data sovereignty or some other consideration where there's legitimate reasons that they need edge infrastructure. And that's where Azure Stack HCI fits in for us. Is you can have a consistent set of tools across what you do move to the cloud and what you keep on-prem. But we don't really have a favorite between those, right? We're quite happy to deliver services that work both places.
So I want to talk about two things then. One being the cloud experience and the services and capabilities available in the cloud and how you drag those down and make them available on-prem in the HCI world as well. Containers being a big one. I know you guys are big on AKS and delivering that. So let's come back to that one. The other issue being one of well, you know what? Before we go there, let's talk containers, because I want to get into this. So I love the notion of enabling cloud services in the cloud and then bringing them down to the on-prem as well, because that gives if I'm in app development for my organization, I can maybe develop it in the cloud and then run it live on-prem, or the other way around, or use the cloud to scale. Talk about containers though specifically, and what that means for your HCI solution.
Yeah, great prompt. So there's actually two things I would say here that are important, and they're kind of, it's like digging a tunnel from both sides, right? And so,
but they never line up. How do you make sure they line up?
Actually, we've gotten pretty good at that in the last month. So the first thing to say is you're absolutely right. So containers, and in particular using Kubernetes to manage containers, is definitely, it's not just a fad. It's a stay, right? This is how the vast majority of modern applications that are being written new today are actually being written, is to run on Kubernetes. That's true of workloads that our customers are building. It's actually also true of a lot of what we're building in-house at Microsoft. And so when you see us talking about bringing our cloud services to the edge, the secret sauce that's actually making that work is the Azure Kubernetes service. And so a ton of capabilities in Azure, things like cognitive services or app services or Azure functions, those are things that run on Kubernetes. And as a result, it's not that hard for us to package them up so that they can run on Kubernetes outside of one of our data centers. And so to sort of deliver, that's the one half of the picture, right, is these services can be packaged up and delivered either as virtual machines in some cases, or as containerized applications for Kubernetes most of the time. And so what you need is an infrastructure that can run those things, right, that can deliver reliable, high performance virtual machines and containers. And so that gets us to the other direction that we're digging, right? We announced last fall at our virtual Microsoft Ignite that we have brought the Azure Kubernetes service to Azure Stack HCI. And this runs completely on your on-premises cluster. So the control plane, the management, all of it is running on Azure Stack HCI. And it gives you the ability to run containerized workloads and Kubernetes workloads that were originally designed for a public cloud like AKS and Azure. You can now run them on AKS on Azure Stack HCI. And so, of course, we've had to do a ton of work on my engineering team and on our peer teams to do things like take the high performance storage that's in Storage Spaces Direct and map that up into containers so that a pod can make a volume claim and actually get, like, you know, the storage class memory that you talked about earlier underneath through Storage Spaces Direct. So that's kind of us digging from the other side. On the one hand, sure, we're bringing AKS to HCI, and on the other hand, we're bringing a bunch of Azure workloads to AKS. And the result is, yeah, now as a customer, you can run app services, web apps, functions, cognitive services, manage SQL, data services, like a whole bunch of the things that you would have thought once upon a time were, like, I guess, exclusive to public cloud.
Right.
You can now run those on the machines that you control, that you own, that you manage on your premises. It's pretty cool.
Well, it must be a big deal, because when I look through the blogs on Microsoft's site for Azure Stack HCI, you guys are doing an update once a month, it looks like, a monthly blast just on AKS. So what's new, what's available. So it sounds like, one, you're iterating pretty quickly there to bring more of those features out. And two, looking at the engagement numbers, just the read views at a high level, I mean, those seem like they're getting a lot of engagement too, which is also a good sign. But tell me about the dev cycles there. How are you delivering additional features and being able to keep up and keep that tunnel all the way open and aligned with the public cloud version?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the velocity in the Kubernetes community is just really high. Right, and so there's a new Kubernetes version of AKS, I believe, every 3 months. And we have set out to try to not fall very far behind that. At this stage, as you say, we have a ton of engagement. There are a lot of customers who who are not only using AKS on top of Azure Stack HCI, but who are also giving us a ton of feedback about AKS on top of Azure Stack HCI.
I'm sure they're not short on feedback.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, it's wonderful though, right? Like that may come off like it's some sort of a euphemism for criticism.
No,
it's great, actually, right?
But those app dev guys tend to be really communicative about when your thing is not doing what they want it to do. They will let you know.
And that's wonderful. I mean, we welcome it, right? As a product manager, there's like nothing more delightful than someone who is enthused and passionate about your product saying, hey, I would like it to do X or Y additional thing. And so if you take a look at like the August update for AKS on HCI or the September update for AKS on HCI, they're modest updates, right? Because they're once a month, so obviously we're not like completely rewriting the thing every time. But there are real important new capabilities that we're adding. Things like support for static IPs, things like better validation when you input like a range of virtual addresses for your VIP pool, things like the ability to taint nodes when you have a multi-node worker pool. There's all sorts of little capabilities that are, I mean, we've got this big backlog based on what customers have told us, and we're sort of steadily working through it. And we expect to keep up that frequent cadence. One of the key things that we're doing with both AKS on Azure Stack HCI as well as with HCI itself is treating it as an always up-to-date subscription service, right? So there's not like you don't buy a version and then at some later time think about ho-hum, maybe I should buy the next version. Like you just always get whatever our team has built most recently, as long as you're a subscriber. And so with AKS, you're right, the velocity is really, really high. And we're excited about that. I mean, I don't know if you follow the AKS team in Azure Public Cloud, but it's led by Brendan Burns, the guy who invented Kubernetes. And he sort of makes a monthly ritual out of poking fun at other clouds, which are never as up to date as Azure with the latest Kubernetes version. And I think maybe a little bit of that culture has rubbed off on the AKS team on HCI as well.
There we go. There we go. All right, so let's go way backwards because I wanted to follow these two thoughts at the same time. The other thing that I think is important to understand, and we've been talking about it this week here with Howard at DataON, is Microsoft's approach to Azure Stack HCI has changed a little bit too, because you started out kind of like a feature in Windows, if not to maybe oversimplified a little bit, but now you've got the Azure Stack OS install to get these guys rolling on the nodes, and it feels a little more productized, for lack of a better word, than maybe the last couple years. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of shift in the way you guys are thinking and delivering on Azure Stack HCI?
Yeah, it's a very profound shift, and I won't try to sort of varnish or gloss over any of this, right? Anyone who runs a business or is in business, I think will understand the fundamental difference within an organization between when something is a feature of a product versus when it has a P&L, it has business accountability, it has like its own, productization, its own life cycle, its own revenue, its own customers, its own backlog of feedback, right? And you're right that in the last 2 years, Azure Stack HCI has graduated from being a feature of Windows Server, kind of an experiment, okay, wouldn't it be nice if some people set up their servers this way? Maybe they could turn them into HCI clusters, to now being a product that we absolutely internally run as a business, right? We track our growth metrics, we track customer churn, we have a dedicated support organization where all they do every day is either support HCI customers or train to better support HCI customers, right? That's something we never had before. And so you're absolutely right that there's been a pretty significant shift. I don't know how much of it is necessarily perceived externally. Like, yes, we've gone from saying, please install Windows Server to saying, hey, you should please install this purpose-built OS and then connect it up to Azure, and all of the support and billing and everything else, like even at some point, like more and more of the management like flows through Azure, right? So I guess some of that you can perceive as a customer, but there's a whole rest of the iceberg in-house too, which if you're a business person or if you've been in business, I think you probably understand what a difference that makes in terms of our ability to execute on this product and also the commitment that it signals. We're a business unit within Microsoft, and I think that gives our customers confidence in an important way as well.
So what's your agreed upon direction then? So if you're a business unit, is your mission to dethrone VMware? Is it less ambitious and to be in every SMB infrastructure? I mean, what's the mission statement? Where do you want to go?
Yeah, it's a fair question. So Azure Stack HCI is part of an organization called the Azure Edge and Platform team. And I would say our team in particular is focused very much on, I would say, doing right by the Hyper-V customer. And that maybe oversimplifies, but Hyper-V has an enormous community around it. Storage Spaces Direct to some extent also does, actually. These are individuals and organizations who have chosen this technology stack to run all or some of their business. And we want to make sure that they have access to the best virtualization and the best edge infrastructure experience that we as Microsoft can provide. And so that involves taking as much of the management innovation that we do in Azure, as much of the hypervisor and host innovation as we do in Azure, as much of that as possible, and delivering that to this, if you'll permit me to call it that, this kind of Hyper-V customer who's saying, hey, Microsoft, I need to run an infrastructure. Like, what should I run, right? Now, those customers overwhelmingly, like I said, are becoming Azure customers. And so how serving them sort of looks ends up looking vaguely Azure-like. That's actually not the goal, strictly speaking. The goal is give them great management tools, give them the workloads that they need, give them infrastructure that does what they need it to do. But increasingly, sort of that's the what, but the how is increasingly becoming, let's leverage Azure for the various strengths that it has. And a good example of that is like the multi-cluster monitoring capability that we rolled out a little earlier this year. It had been a sort of perennial point of feedback from customers that HCI is great at branch offices and edge deployments and things like that. The problem was all of Microsoft's management tools were intended to manage a single cluster at a time. And like, well, wait a minute, a branch office by definition, I have multiple of them, right? So help me out. And we didn't have a tool that you could use to actually see like all of your clusters in a single pane of glass. And so forget Azure and like forget Arc and all of that. That was just like feedback we were getting from Hyper-V and Storage Spaces Direct customers. They were like, hey, it would be great if I could easily monitor all of these things in one place. And sometimes that feedback sort of came in the form of specific suggestions, like please add this to Windows Admin Center, or please add this to insert my favorite tool here. But we took a look at this problem and we said, well, first of all, we agree it's a problem. Like, this is a real scenario. This makes a ton of sense. We would like to build something here that helps our customers. What's the best way that we can do it? And we realized actually in this specific case that by far the easiest way to do this is going to be to use Azure Arc, and use Azure Monitor. Because Azure Monitor has this world-class set of alerting capabilities and charting capabilities. Like, you can customize everything in Azure Monitor. It's amazing. It's got all these outbound integrations where you can get a Slack message or a Teams message or a ServiceNow message, right? So like, it was sort of staring us in the face. All right, this is the way to tackle this problem. So how we decided to do it was, well, based on the feedback we'd heard from our customers. But then the technology choices we made were sort of dictated by where is Microsoft investing right now, which is in Azure Monitor. And so that's why we rolled out earlier this year this multi-cluster monitoring scenario through Azure Monitor Insights that's specifically for Azure Stack HCI. So it's super easy to set up. It's not some sort of generic thing. It's like an HCI multi-cluster monitoring experience, but it is built in Azure Monitor because that was the best way we could deliver it. So I would say, yeah, focused on serving the Hyper-V customer and their needs first and foremost. We've got a ton of them. Like, the installed base is huge. Love them. And so we want to make sure that they have the best tools that we can make for them and the best infrastructure experience that we can make for them. And increasingly, that's going to end up looking like we're sort of leaning on Azure for stuff. But actually, I think that's more of an engineering efficiency thing than a goal in and of itself.
Yeah, well, talking about this setup, so the fundamental difference of going to the HCI OS, I know I've already said it, you said it a second time, that's a big deal. That's a big change for you guys. And to me, that's really what helps it feel like a product and its own solution, right? Because that's the starting point, and then you layer your VMs or whatever else on top and get rolling. So talk a little bit more, if you can, about the connection from Azure then to the HCI OS and how that process is well, cloudifying, I guess, even the local deployments of HCI I feel like there's a little more there in terms of that integration.
Yeah, no, you're right. And not only is there a little more there, but there will be even more as time goes on. So there's, I mean, at a high level, I would say there's sort of three things that we see as unique opportunities for us to bring something special and valuable to our customers.
Okay.
Obviously, there's a lot of things we can do that are like, where Microsoft may or may not do the best one ever, but like, we need to have it, so we have it, right? But on internally, and this actually comes all the way from the top. So Satya, our CEO, his guidance to all of us is always like, think about what we as Microsoft can uniquely bring here. Like, we have a set of capabilities and a set of circumstances. Like, there's some sort of a unique contribution that we can make to the world, and let's figure out what that is, and then make that what we focus on. And so for HCI, there's kind of three, the way that we see it. There's the Azure workloads, and maybe I can call them like Azure benefits, like the things that make it great to run a virtual desktop infrastructure in Azure, for example, or a Kubernetes deployment in Azure. To the extent that we can bring those workloads onto Azure Stack HCI, that's pretty unique and pretty valuable. That can certainly make things easier to manage than otherwise. So, like, if you're a customer who's used AKS before, it's kind of magic in the cloud. Like, it's like push button, and you get like a Kubernetes cluster that's properly set up with the Flannel CNI and with a storage driver, and like it's really hard actually to set that up on your own. And yet with AKS on HCI, it's the same experience as the cloud. It's push button. You just deploy, and now you have a Kubernetes environment. So that's the first thing where we think we can do something pretty unique and pretty different, is bringing these Azure workloads and Azure sort of like maybe end user experiences onto Azure Stack HCI. The second thing that we can do that's pretty unique is our engineering team, the Azure Edge and Platform team, is the same. Like, we actually have two jobs. We are responsible for building Azure Stack HCI, but we're also responsible for the rollout of the Azure Host OS, so the OS that we run on the metal in our Azure fleet. So, I mean, it's like pretty stressful. We have more than 1 million machines across all of our Azure regions. We like to talk about how we have more Azure regions than any other cloud, and that's still true, and that's a lot of computers. Really, I mean, we're busy at the same time of the month as everyone else is busy, because like we're constantly keeping these machines secured and up to date. And so we develop a bunch of tools and technologies in the course of doing that. An example that I've spoken about before is kernel soft reboot, which allows restarting a machine faster. And so the second unique thing that we think we can do is bring some of that host and hypervisor level innovation to our customers in the form of Azure Stack HCI. And that's like, if you want to take an inside out view, that's kind of why we have that product actually, is so that we can it's like a vehicle for us to bring this value to that Hyper-V audience that I talked about. But the third thing, and this gets to your question, is Azure management innovation, right? So in Azure, there's a certain way that you interact with your resources. And if you're an Azure customer, you've gotten used to it over time, right? You can search for anything in the Omni search bar at the top center of the screen. And whether it is a resource or a service or a resource group, or like, it will just come up instantly, right? There's a really robust indexer for everything that you have. And if you have 100,000 virtual machines in your subscription, it still works, right? And so like, that's one of these things that you just get used to when you're using Azure. It's like, everything is indexable, everything is taggable, everything's organized into resource groups. I can provision and delete things really easily using a consistent set of patterns, and I can just search for whatever I want in the Omni search, right? And so you get used to those things as a customer. And what we've asked ourselves is, how much of that can we make true of Azure Stack HCI and of the workloads that you run on Azure Stack HCI? And so step, because you mentioned registration, is when you deploy an Azure Stack HCI OS now, like on a physical server, and you deploy a cluster of such servers, one of the steps you do is you register it with Azure, which means you sort of hook it up, or you wire it up to your Azure subscription. This does a few things. It provides capabilities for our support team. It also sets up a set of sort of billing infrastructure so that all the licensing like automatically happens. You don't have to, there's no keys or anything, right? Like it just figures out how much you're doing, how many cores you have, and everything takes care of itself. But then also, like from that point onward, your HCI cluster is searchable. It's taggable. It's in a resource group too. Like it's fully participating in that Azure Resource Manager model, just as if it was something that's in Azure. And we think that that's really valuable, and that's going to continue to get more and more rich over time. Like one of the big things, I guess, I don't know if I'm spoiling something, but like today your cluster and the nodes show up. A little later this year, your VMs will start to show up as well. And so thing by thing, like more and more of what you might want to find is going to be searchable and taggable in Azure as if it was an Azure resource, which is really, really valuable. And to your point, that's not some sort of a bolt-on, that's a profound integration. So like the componentry that makes that possible is baked into the OS for Azure Stack HCI. Like there is a protected process that is always running. It starts every time the OS starts. Nothing can get in the way of it running. And it manages that sort of connection to Azure. It manages heartbeating, it manages syncing metadata between the cloud representation and the actual source of truth on-prem. And things like the certificates that you need to be able to communicate with Azure, like you as a user never have to do any of that because this OS native, it's called HCI SVC. If you want to go look it up, you can like see it like any other service, but it's an OS service that is constantly managing your connection to Azure for you. And so that's been a huge, you can imagine, that's a big engineering investment for us. And we've got a whole pipeline of capabilities, some of which we'll talk about a little later this year. We do have Ignite coming up in just about 6 weeks. There's a whole bunch of new capabilities that are coming to that sort of hybrid connection so that this gets richer and richer over time.
So how do you guys think about it then in terms of driving these features from the cloud and cloud consumption style models of usability? It doesn't sound like, though, what you want to do is take Azure public cloud and drop it off in a box on site at a customer's on-prem location, because that consumption model is just different than the more traditional VM-based model, but that you still want to bubble up a lot of those features. How do you manage the blend when you're in your team meetings figuring out what features to pull down and how to do it, but have it not exactly feel like a cloud on-prem, but still have cloudy things? Like there's just sort of a negotiation that must go on.
Yeah, this is actually, I'm not flattering you. This is, I think, the favorite question I've gotten in a long time, because you're spot on. Like it is not black and white how to navigate a lot of these trade-offs, and it is absolutely something that my product team spends a ton of time thinking about, and not just thinking, but like polling customers, trying various prototypes and showing them to customers and seeing what feedback we get. Because you're right, it's a balancing act, right? On the one hand, we want to deliver cloud-like management where that is valuable. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, we're trying to be like very, very eyes wide open and appreciative of all of the precedent that exists here with on-premises infrastructure, right? Hyper-V has been around and has been very popular for like more than a decade. And so people absolutely have a way that they do things, right? I'm talking about helping you find resources with the Azure portal. People have a way. They may not like it, but like every single Hyper-V administrator has a workflow for how they track down an object, whether it's a VHD or a VM, right? Like they have a way of doing it. It's not like they're sitting there as like a damsel in distress saying, I don't know where the VMs are, right?
Right.
And yeah, you can now use Azure policy to like apply certain configurations to Azure Stack HCI, but people had a way of doing that before too, right? Every one of these capabilities that we're bringing over, it is the successor, or at least the sort of moral or spiritual successor to something that people already have a way of doing, at least for the most part. And what's really important to me, and I sort of stress this with my team all the time, is we're offering new capability. If customers think it's valuable, they'll use it, and like tip, they do, right? But it should be additive. Like we should be saying, hey, if you have a way of doing things and that is already working for you, like that's awesome. Please, by all means, continue. We think there's merits to adding this to your workflow, or adding this tool to your tool belt. And if you'd like to, you can. And our job is to make that as easy as possible. But it's not about trying to force people to change what they don't want to change. And I think that's really important. And so you see this, I'll give an example, like in the licensing model. It's kind of a weird example, but it's the first one I thought of. With HCI, we had to, choose like, how is this thing gonna bill you, right? And one option, to your point, would have been a completely consumption-based, like just however many vCPUs the customer has. But there's a big problem with that, at least the way we saw it, which is organizations and IT professionals have been honing their skills for decades on how to run an efficient infrastructure, on how to identify like a virtual to physical ratio that is sensible, and how to pack in workloads as densely as they can, right? Technologies like thin provisioning or deduplication, like they're all about packing more workload into an infrastructure. And if we charged by vCPU, we'd be punishing those who do a good job at that, right? If you packed in more workloads, you'd end up getting charged more because you'd have more vCPUs. And so we didn't like that. We were like, that creates this weird kind of reverse incentive that we don't want. We want we want the things that are good in Hyper-V administration today to still be good tomorrow, right? And so we settled on a model that was as close to actually what we think folks are already familiar with Windows Server, which is like a based on your physical cores kind of model. We settled as close to that as we could. We made it, we got rid of some of the things like the minimum cores and stuff, so now small systems are better accommodated. And of course, it's just like, it's month to month, so you can stop anytime. There's some differences, but we tried to keep it familiar because, again, folks have been doing a great job for like more than a decade with Hyper-V, and we're not trying to show up and like rip and replace stuff, right? We're trying to add value where we can add value, but embrace the things that work as well.
Well, so speaking of adding value, how is it that you go through the process of determining what's going to be next? So whatever you're going to announce in a couple weeks that you're either working on or is going GA or whatever phase of the process, how are you sitting around managing that marker board of Q1 we want to deliver this? Is it all customer? Is it Azure public cloud's excited about something and you need to have a version or a connection to that in local infrastructure? Is it vSAN does this and we don't do this, we need to have that to be competitive? What's the main driver?
Yes. So
okay.
It's definitely all of the things that you said and then some. So we do pay, I'm not going to lie to you, we do pay close attention to the competitive landscape, right?
You must. That's reasonable.
We have a gap analysis at any given moment between us and our top at least 2 competitors. We do pay a lot of attention to customer feedback. So we run, obviously we run public previews for many things, but we also run like a private preview program where we engage with our customers very closely. We have this system where we map every product manager in the company to a customer that they are the buddy, the PM buddy for. And then we do various exercises to sort of share our learnings amongst ourselves. So like I'm paired with a customer in my home country, Canada, and we meet with them regularly, and all of our other PMs are doing the same. So customer feedback is certainly a big signal for us. And you're also right that there's some amount of where the technology sort of leads a bit, right? And so we have some really brilliant engineers at Microsoft, way smarter than me. And they often come up with ideas that they can apply first in an Azure context. So like either an infrastructure innovation of some kind, like kernel soft reboot, or a management innovation of some kind, like a lot of the work that's going on with AKS in the public cloud, or with Azure Virtual Desktop and its hosted control plane, things like that. And so sometimes we are sort of motivated by that, and we say, oh, well, look, this is like super useful. We should absolutely make that available to customers in their data center as well, because it makes sense. And so sometimes we have projects where it's just like, oh, this technology exists now. It didn't exist a year ago, but it exists now. Let's make sure that it's really workable and manageable in HCI. I would say, though, because that's kind of a cop-out, I basically just said yes and all of the above, which is true. I would say there is a lens that we're sort of using a lot of late, and you'll see me and my team talk about this more and more over the coming couple of years, and that is these priority workloads, and this is actually something that we have the luxury of observing in Azure. We can see how much usage in Azure is like servers versus virtual desktops versus Kubernetes clusters, right? We can't see what customers are doing inside of their VMs, obviously, but we can at least observe like how many of each are running, right? And that's easy to observe from the outside. I mean, we have to provision enough infrastructure for it, right? So of course we have to observe that. And so for us, it's very interesting to see the trends there. And to think about, okay, for each of those sort of scenarios or those priority workloads, whether that's, again, Kubernetes or desktops or like the latest sort of Windows Server workloads or Linux workloads for that matter, what can we do to like make the experience of running those better on Azure Stack HCI? And so more and more, I think you'll see some of the things we announce later this year, and then also going into next year and beyond, that'll be sort of very workload centric. That's not to say exclusive to a workload or like tied down in any way. But like we're starting to really focus on, okay, here's a sort of a vertical scenario to make really, really excellent, and then do a gap analysis on that. And it's amazing with software, right? There's always ways you can make it better.
Yeah, well, let me ask you about that specifically, because one that seems to be coming up more and more are these edge analytics, AI, ML sort of use cases with some degree of GPU enablement, little T4 or whatever, A100, V100 in these systems. What's your story there for that kind of workload to enable this facial recognition? I know Microsoft is very much in that business, but maybe not in the HCI yet. I don't know. You give me the update there.
Yeah, excellent question. And so today our story actually would be actually a little bit of Swiss cheese. Like there's quite a few things that are not great right now. And the team has been hard at work addressing them in the 21H2 feature update that's coming out like in just a couple of weeks. And so one of the big innovations there, and it's specifically for this scenario that you're alluding to, is you can now take a GPU like a T4 or an A100, those are great examples, or an A10 for that matter, right? You can take a GPU like that, attach it to a virtual machine that is a clustered virtual machine in an Azure Stack HCI context, and it can fail over between servers if there's like a server failure. And it can also participate in the cluster in sort of a more controlled way. Like if you want to pause and drain one of the nodes for maintenance, the virtual machine can move to a different machine and then get assigned to a GPU when it arrives at the destination. So it's based on discrete device assignment technology. Right now, it's still 1:1. So a whole GPU is assigned to a single virtual machine. But that turns out to be exactly what these workloads you're describing want anyway, right? If you've got a camera feed, you've got a single large application that needs to process that video stream as it's coming through and look for faces or look for movement or things like that. And so now that virtual machine can be accelerated and can still be highly available. So it can move around between the nodes in the cluster, it can fail over. And all of this uses a technology and a concept that's called GPU pools, which we've never had before. So we're going to spend a lot of time this fall, I think, talking about and explaining and educating folks on how GPU pools work. Of course, you don't have to worry about it if you don't have a workload that needs GPU acceleration. But we know increasingly, you're right, a lot of customers do. And for that reason, actually, we've been partnering with a lot of our hardware partners as well. So one of the things you'll see when 21H2, the feature update for HCI, when that rolls out in a couple of weeks, we're also going to roll out an update to our hardware catalog that will highlight which solutions are GPU capable.
Okay.
It's really becoming something that we hear about a lot from customers.
Well, I think it's one of those things. You talked about facial recognition. I mean, it's just, I don't want to say it's easy, but that's like an easy workload for these things to go do at the edge. And then you get into the whole conversation of, okay, well now if I'm doing this at the edge, what data do I really need to keep? Because I don't need to send dozens of cam feeds to the core data center. Maybe I only want this 8-second snippet when an identified customer comes in or does some behavior that sales and marketing's tracking or whatever, right, to get those feedback points, but maybe not everything. That one I think is really cool, and it is one to watch. All right, I want to do one more trip around the performance track before I let you go. I know you're fond of getting on stage and yelling about 15 or 20 million IOPS or something, right?
Yes.
I haven't heard you yell lately about performance. Have you done any cool performance testing lately?
It's a good question. So I'll give a two-part answer. We have some stuff up our sleeve that we're pretty excited about that is not in the 21H2 feature update. It's we're sort of still engineering. So we haven't talked about any of that yet. But believe me, one doesn't get over one's addiction to IOPS. So not just the rest of our team as well. Like there's stuff coming. We're having a lot of fun. There are some things though that are not like 2x top line increase in performance, but that are still significant and that are in the 21H2 feature update later this year. I'll give one example that I think is actually pretty important, especially as cybersecurity looms more and more for folks. If you look at, let's say you had deployed like storage spaces direct with Windows Server 2016 or something, right? You could not encrypt the traffic that was flowing between the clustered nodes and also use RDMA at the same time. Like those were incompatible with each other. And if you did encrypt the traffic, the CPU consumption was very, very high, even with just like 128-bit, which was the only encryption that SMB supported at the time. Everything I just described has been significantly ameliorated in this feature update that's coming later this year for Azure Stack HCI. You can now use encryption and RDMA. They are compatible. So turning on encryption does not get rid of that offload and that acceleration for the traffic between the nodes. You can also encrypt the traffic up to 256-bit, which is, we know, important for some customers, especially in regulated industries, where it's not that they have a particular point of view on key length, but like they are required to use 256. And this is the real fun one, there's a set of accelerations available in the latest generation of Intel Xeon Scalable processors, in the Gen 3 Xeon Scalable Ice Lake, that actually offloads, if you will, the AES encryption, the advanced encryption standard, that SMB uses to do this encryption. So it's called vectorized AES. And it potentially gives you up to about a 30% in how quickly and therefore how many IOPS you can drive with encryption enabled. When you stack all of these things together, it's like a lot more than 30%, right? So you can actually encrypt up to 256-bit, still use RDMA offloads, and use this new vectorized AES from Intel, all of which put together makes it practical to encrypt the traffic between your nodes now for the first time, which we're pretty excited about. So of course, in a data center environment, maybe you don't need to, because you trust that nobody has physical access to it anyway. But in the context of like an edge deployment, servers are sitting in a closet in a retail store. It is not inconceivable that somebody could actually sit between them and read the traffic, right? And being able to encrypt that now is a big deal. And so we've been focusing on little things like that for performance, where it's not how many million IOPS can you do, but it's a little more subtle. But we'll get back to the millions of IOPS. Don't worry.
All right. Well, I'll give you a not subtle version of one we're working on. So we've been working this week here at DataON's office with 3 nodes with these 3.84 terabyte 5510s. And as you know, all this componentry is getting harder and harder to come by. So we said, let's just build a minimum cluster. We put 5 drives in 3 nodes. Ice Lake, Gen 3 Intel Xeon. The network traffic between the nodes is so efficient these days on Azure Stack HCI, it's unbelievable. And even just doing some light synthetic work, we're seeing over 4 million random 4K read IOPS. 4 million out of a total of 15 drives in 3 nodes. That's sick. Like, that's crazy.
Can you? I'm just trying to think back, even one generation. Can you imagine saying you were getting to 1 million IOPS per node, and then now you're telling me you've got like a whole extra million in there somehow?
We've got a bonus million, yes.
But between the network traffic and the innovation that's going on at the device layer with the actual drives themselves, and then our team is we try to be pretty disciplined about not letting our software get in the way. This matters to us because, of course, we operate we have more nodes in Azure than we have HCI customers right now, right? Mm-hmm. So we are our own biggest customer for this stuff. We need it to be as efficient as possible. So we try to be pretty disciplined about not letting bloat get into the software stack. Between all of those factors, the performance is pretty good.
Yeah, well, a couple weeks ago, we had Jason Adrian on the podcast, storage guy over at Azure, and we were talking Ruler mostly in that conversation. But the software side, the hardware engineering that's going on, you were talking about some of the not hidden features of Intel Ice Lake, but some of the stuff that Intel talks about or is on the spec sheet, but is hard to articulate the benefits of in the final consumption of those CPUs. But yeah, as a package, it's pretty amazing, and I think more people are going to keep checking out this stack as it gets, the guys like DataON get the new hardware out, get the new OS out. You've got this big update coming in a couple weeks. I mean, there's a lot of momentum, a lot of reasons to be excited about it. And if you also want to have a high performance HCI cluster, I think that's the best kept secret about what you guys are doing. The performance profile for HCI is unbelievable compared to everything else we've seen, and we've seen all of it.
And I agree with you. I mean, the demand for performance is only going to increase, and so between that and everything else that we've talked about today, I mean, it's a very exciting time for edge infrastructure, and I think you can count on the Azure team, referring to myself and my team, to keep delivering on this. And so there's the feature update coming this year. There will be another one next year, and it's going to be a lot of fun to see where this goes.
Well, we can't wait. Certainly appreciate you joining in today. It's been an awesome conversation. Your Roomba didn't take off either, which I was nervous about the whole time. But this is great. Thanks for joining us, and love having you on.
Brian, thank you for having me. Take care.